The United States Navy had defeated the Japanese in major naval battles by the summer of 1944. American submarines frequently sank Japanese merchant ships and crippled Japan's ability to continue fighting. In August 1944, Japan's Premier Tojo and his entire cabinet was forced to resign in disgrace. U.S. Navy Admiral Chester Nimitz proposed an invasion of the small island of Okinawa south of Japan to close the door between Japan and its forces in Southeast Asia and China. Japan imported 80% of its oil, 88% of its iron ore, and 20% of its food supplies. A blockade would devastate Japan's industry while Japanese military forces ran out of ammunition and spare parts. After Okinawa was secured and the blockade enforced by the U.S. Army Air Corps, the U.S. Navy could send task forces northward and take the war directly to Japan. This did not occur in late 1944 because of a senseless and bloody diversion to liberate the Philippines. The U.S. Navy prepared for an invasion of Okinawa in October 1944 by sending a huge carrier task force to wipe out Japanese air power on Okinawa and nearby Formosa. The U.S. Navy's Task Force 38, with 17 aircraft carriers and over 1,000 aircraft, swept through the region from October 10th to the 16th. It destroyed around 500 Japanese aircraft and sunk any ships it found. While Japan had substantial aircraft in Asia, they were widely dispersed and difficult to employ in mass since nearly all its aircraft carriers had been sunk. The U.S. Navy could remain in the region to intercept all ship traffic. Any Japanese naval force that attempted to break this blockade would have limited air cover and be slaughtered. The logistics to support this blockade would be difficult from distant bases in the Marianas. Invading Okinawa in October 1944 to establish a supply port and airfields would ensure a solid blockade that could extend northward to Korea to cut off Japanese access to China as well. Okinawa was large enough to support hundreds of U.S. Army, Air Corps, and Marine Corps fighters to make a blockade impregnable and free naval forces to attack Japan. But Okinawa was not invaded until April 1945 because the U.S. Navy was tasked with supporting a senseless U.S. Army invasion of the Philippines for 6 months. A landing on Okinawa in October 1944 would have elicited the same Japanese response as the landing in the Philippines that same month, which led to the Battle of Leyte Gulf, where much of the remaining Japanese air and naval power in the Pacific was destroyed. The Japanese would have suffered greater losses if forced to fight near Okinawa because it was beyond the range of most Japanese aircraft in the Philippines. As the naval blockade of Japan began, the U.S. Army's Air Corps B-29 bombers from the Marianas could drop sea mines in Japanese waters to shut down all ship traffic between Japan's main islands. 3/4 of all Japanese transportation involved coastal traffic. Half of the electrical power used by Japanese industry came from coal shipped via coastal waters. The U.S. Navy had argued for dropping sea mines by bombers since 1943 to copy the success the British had demonstrated. However, most bomber generals were not interested in naval missions. Common sense prevailed, and thousands of sea mines were dropped beginning in March 1945 as part of Operation Starvation. These mines sunk 500 ships, damaged many more, and ship traffic dropped 90%. Historian Kenneth Worrell noted, quote, "Mining the waters around the home islands struck the fatal blow of the blockade, and the B-29s visible in the sky every day and the smoldering cities convinced the Japanese that they had no alternative but to surrender," end quote. As the blockade strangled Japan and B-29s blasted cities, the U.S. Navy could strike a final blow by sending its aircraft carriers into Japanese waters, as was eventually done in July 1945. More than 1,000 carrier-based planes were employed to strafe and bomb every train and truck in Japan, while battleships blasted targets ashore. These attacks devastated Japan's northernmost island of Hokkaido. It was beyond the range of B-29 bombers, so had not been attacked, and operated Japan's only remaining oil refinery and steel mills. The U.S. Navy quickly destroyed those facilities. Japan sent word through its embassies in neutral nations that it wanted to discuss surrender terms beginning in February 1945. Details of these negotiations remain secret to this day, but American leaders were satisfied with the terms for conditional surrender by April 1945 and presented them for approval by the Allies at the Potsdam Conference in July 1945. Plans for the invasion of Japan were replaced with a detailed plan for the occupation of Japan in May 1945, called Operation Blacklist. See the link below. The United States delayed final acceptance of Japan's surrender offer for 4 months because it wanted to demonstrate its new atomic bombs that were not ready until August. See the short video link below. Note that Japan had begun seeking surrender terms before the American invasion of Okinawa, and before the Operation Starvation aerial mining, and before the U.S. Navy established a blockade and invaded its waters to wreak havoc. If the Philippines had been bypassed, these operations could have taken place before the end of 1944, and Japan would have surrendered much sooner. The U.S. Army landed 7 divisions in the central Philippines in October 1944 that could have landed on Okinawa instead. When the U.S. Army eventually landed on Okinawa, it did so with 7 divisions. The Army would have another Army and a Marine division available that were wasted on the senseless invasion of Peleliu that resulted in 10,000 American casualties. See the short video link below. Victory in the Pacific was delayed for months by the unneeded diversion to the Philippines. U.S. Army battles in the Philippines eventually required over 1 million American troops in 17 U.S. Army divisions. Over 24,000 Americans were killed, along with 57,000 supporting Filipino soldiers. Thousands of Filipino civilians were killed, and many cities heavily damaged. The battle to retake the Philippine capital of Manila destroyed much of the city. In contrast, there was no bloodshed in bypass cities like Singapore or Jakarta, where Japanese troops peacefully surrendered in 1945. The effort to free American POWs in the Philippines by force resulted in the death of dozens. It is unclear who to blame for this disaster. Admiral Ernest King and other members of the Joint Chiefs of Staff supported Nimitz's idea of bypassing the Philippines and blockading and attacking Japan. Popular General Douglas MacArthur was the chief advocate for retaking the Philippines first, to fulfill his famous pledge, "I shall return." He sought to restore his reputation after his disastrous defense effort in 1942. See the short video link below. However, MacArthur did not have the final say, and it is unclear if President Franklin Roosevelt supported him or Admiral Nimitz changed his mind. When Japan's conditional surrender was finally accepted, most Japanese soldiers were stranded throughout the Pacific. They peacefully surrendered without firing a shot. This would have occurred in the Philippines if it had been bypassed. Pointless bloody battles continued in the Philippines until the last day of the war. After Japan's surrender was formally accepted, the 20,000 remaining Japanese troops peacefully surrendered in the Philippines. The effort to retake the Philippines by force was the most costly campaign in the Pacific War. Had the Philippines been bypassed, the war could have ended months earlier, sparing over 200,000 Japanese and American lives. The Soviet Union would have never joined the war, so the communists in China would not have received massive quantities of captured Japanese equipment that they used to defeat the nationalists. See the short video link below. Korea would not have been divided, so that war would not have occurred. The senseless liberation of the Philippines was the greatest American military mistake of World War II, and thus never discussed in official history.